Greetings. Welcome to the South to South Solidarity Dialogue Series, an unfunded, solidarity driven dialogue speaking to activists that are changing the game, assessing the landscape, and inspiring change amongst peers, allies, and community members. And I am seated here with Saida Ali in the heart of Nairobi, a day after the Saba Saba protests, but also acknowledging the importance of what it might look like from a Pan-African lens to speak towards climate and gender justice. Hi, Saida, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Dumi. It's lovely to have you in our country.
Thank you so much for joining this dialogue and helping us sort of document the session that we previously just had. I think it would be great to just sort of introduce yourself and then also just elucidate what you're seeing in the context of civic space in Kenya and maybe some of the observations you might have made with the developments that are happening in our beloved continent.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that, because actually I think the question of civic space is quite loaded. And just as an introduction, so that then I can locate my positionality and how I come into this conversation. At the moment, I like to see myself as a strategist. And I'm a political analyst, a feminist who is a political analyst, and at the same time, an international policy analyst. And speaking of which is quite important when talking about activists, organizing, climate justice, and just thinking about what's going on both in our country and globally in ways that also affect our region as a continent. So first, you've asked me about the civic space in our country. It might seem as a joke, and why I'm giggling or laughing or smiling about it is because when you think about what we've observed in the last, let me say, year, because we've just had the 1 year anniversary of the protests around the finance bill that we saw. Lots of young people being abducted, disappearing, some people killed. Of course, there was property destroyed and so on and so forth. We saw, massively just what state apparatus can do when they are used or when they're in the wrong hands or where they're fueled by impunity, right? And so 1 year down the line, again, we had Kenyans led by a much younger generation, the Gen Zs, go to the streets, not because at that point it was to protest again about the finance bill, but it was an important reminder of how that had started, and an important reminder of the kinds of lives that were lost, an important reminder to what can go absolutely wrong. And we've seen this over the years. This is not the first time we're seeing police killings, in our country. This is not the first time we're seeing political power being misused, corruption and so on, to cause chaos, so to speak. But it was important to actually acknowledge the moment that 1 year ago we lost lives. Why? Because we've had Kenyans go to the streets to demand accountability, just underlining their accountability, which is very important when you're thinking about governance, when you're thinking about the kinds of policies that we should have, the kinds of policies that are gender just, the kinds of policies that are inclusive, they don't leave people behind, and they pay attention to the existing inequalities. So whether we are talking the social, the economic, health inequities that we see in our country. So when you've seen that kind of demand, what we expected or what we should have seen was a response that equally matches that recognition. But that's not what we got, right? You've mentioned, this is just 1 day, yes, after Saba Saba. The Saba Saba protests are very significant to what we see as our second liberation in this country. Basically, these are pro-democracy protests that started in 1990 or were major in 1990 on 7th of July. Again, of course, people were killed in the streets. Again, the police, the same apparatus, state apparatus being used, to muffle, to repress, to kill, and at that time, of course, the push was for a shift for a multi-party democracy, and to, all of that is tied to all the way to how we came to also get the new constitution, which is no longer new because then we got it promulgated in 2010, right? So for me, when you look at that space, when you look at Kenya in itself, you can expand that conversation to what's happening in the continent. And I want to locate here the issue of gender justice, the issue of exclusion of minorities, whether we are thinking ethnic minorities or whether we are thinking from a sexual and gender point of view, and how we continue to have inequalities that overlap, that are really interconnected to the crises we see. So even as we talk about climate justice, for example, or the climate crisis, we know it is connected to other forms of crises. And today in our session, you rightfully named it, it's a poly-crisis, right? But then when you take Kenya as an example, you can take this conversation and go to Nigeria. You can take this conversation and go to South Africa. You can take this conversation to any of our countries, just next door, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda. You can take this conversation and then frame it from the local realities of what activists are dealing with. And you will then begin to see not just the inequalities, but the kinds of tools that are used by the state to keep, having civic space muffled and taken away. It's not just a shrinking of the civic space. What we are witnessing is really having a complete closure of some of the civic spaces. But at the same time, just to say, there are also opportunities that are opening up in terms of the kinds of things for building solidarity that we are experiencing, for having dialogue and conversations such as this, to continue to encourage, to continue to build community. And that is really key. As we've said, it's much broader than even thinking about just movement building. What is the community and what does solidarity look like?
Thank you so much, Saida, for the TED Talk. But yes, I think that was very important to situate all these dialogues, actually. And so I really appreciate that sort of overview. And I guess maybe, the crux of the question, even when you're mentioning, Nigeria, immediately, as you were responding, I was thinking about the NSARS movement in Nigeria,
absolutely.
Whether you're talking about Fees Must Fall, the Arab Spring, whether you're talking about Shut It Down, Malawi, Zambia, and I am just consistently, I think, almost depressed when thinking about how the state, even in a stable, revered democracy, will still continue to fail its citizens. If not the majority, at least some of its citizens. And I think for me, when we're talking about leaving no one behind, when we're talking about trying to ensure that human rights are universal and indivisible, it means that each and every individual that is in that land. And so I guess maybe the real question is, do you feel like we are free from the colonial legacies, in spite of some of its remnants in, many of our laws, many of our ways of working, and even within our markets? Do you feel like this is a result of that, right, as a part of the colonial project? Or is it that, all these elements of authoritarianism, because that's what it is, have been, readapted and redeployed by the very people that I assume considered as people who liberated many of our countries, right? And is that something that we feel like we eliminated on independence, or we're really seeing the manifestations of a continuation?
I wouldn't say we eliminated. I love the way you framed it, the different nuances and so on, because it feels like it continued, or maybe it stopped and then it continued. And the reason I'm saying this is because, of course, there's a lot of say, or people saying, you know what, you can't always blame colonization, right? But the truth is, you've got to name it.
Yep.
It's important to name things that are problematic for what they caused and what the kind of imprint that that colonization did, right? And what we've seen is, let me say, we can point to situations or countries or processes that have really taken from the indigenous ways of doing things and acknowledging that that knowledge is expertise, and acknowledging that it is legit. And in fact, we should never even be put in a position where we are saying we want indigenous knowledge to be recognized. It should just be, right? But at the same time, what we have is being able to point to examples, and there are many, where you can see a cut and paste of certain aspects of
Tools of the master.
Yeah, exactly. Using the tools of the master, right? You can point to, in fact, there are so many of them, right? Because then, and why I said a cut and paste is because then people think by leading in a certain way, oh, it worked. It's a very oppressive or oppressing mentality. It worked, then we're going to use it because when you give people freedoms, what is that going to look like? The fear that there can be someone else will get up and challenge certain things. The concerns that people will lose their power, the concerns that someone will call them out for what they are amassing, what they are stealing. So we pointed out to situations of extraction, right, that were happening during the colonial period, and the building of the empire, for example, on the backs of our foremothers and forefathers, right? But at the same time, we continue to see in our leaders, corrupt leaders who steal from the people, who do not invest the resources, say, from taxation into the kinds of resources that are needed to improve our health facilities, for example, health systems, to make it broader, right? So it's a really systemic problem. It's not one where we can say, oh, it is all colonial mentality, but at the same time, at some point, we really have to call out people for them being bad leaders, just for what they are.
And I guess maybe then the question is, because leadership isn't a position, right?
Yeah.
And I think we've seen a lot of deficiency in leadership because the lack of, political will is very evident.
Yeah.
And so then amidst this polycrisis, right? And amidst all these inequities and injustices that are being perpetuated in many instances by the state or enabled by the state, right?
Yeah.
So it's state-sponsored as a conceptualization, which is very important. What maybe are two low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term, that you see as opportunities for communities to take leadership in... I guess, the problem is, the challenge is accountability for someone in power seems like a threat, right?
Yeah.
So what opportunities do you see for citizens to ensure that their rights are not only safeguarded, but they're strengthened, and that maybe the aspirations, the kind of Kenya that they want, can actually be realized?
Yeah, some of those things are actually already happening, right? And others perhaps are ignored. Some are obvious, such as, remaining vigilant and taking advantage and using technology, to the advantage of just how easy it is to capture moments, to capture stories, and just
And share information.
and share information.
On impending bills.
Exactly, because just as an example, one of the things that happened in Nairobi during the recent Gen Z protests is that the government ordered that all TV stations stop live streaming. And that's exactly what happened. But how did the rest of the world and the rest of the people that did not go to the protest receive information on what was going on? It was because people used their phones, people used the YouTube channels that they've set up to, to just broadcast that and say, this is what's happening in this area, this is what's happening in this county. But nationwide, actually, it wasn't just Nairobi, nationwide, all TV stations were not able to give news or to cover live what was going on. So one is taking advantage of what
readily available.
Exactly. And the use of the phones is just one of the things that has been a game changer. The other one is the complete opposite of using technology. And this is what we've been talking about, the importance of building community. And for me, why I keep insisting that community in itself as a word is a doing word, because you actually have to commit to meet the others where they are at. The sharing of information now gets beyond the use of technology to the human relations. And investing in that is absolutely important, because this is where you now find the threads of solidarity, and building solidarity is key. It is also important, especially for queer communities. You don't just trust everyone who says this is a safe space, it's going to be safe. But why we can trust it is a safe space is because of the kinds of things that the person will have committed to doing, the kinds of reaching out to build solidarity, to understand spaces get more unsafe, for certain communities when certain situations are what we have to deal with. So for me, community building is another low-hanging fruit and really critical.
So I'm going to shift gears a bit. If I say a word, give me one sentence on what immediately comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
Pan-African.
Africanness.
Okay. Solidarity.
Building.
Feminist.
Together to finish off the patriarch. I am trying not to be violent, but you can understand, together to finish off the patriarch, yes.
Okay. Kenya.
My land, my motherland.
Oh, I'm almost blank now. Okay, decolonization.
Wow, anti-racist, an end to capitalism and extractive economies.
So on that note, maybe, what would be good for us to stop, continue, and do to be anti-racist, to dismantle these very systems of isms, racism, capitalism, and maybe to then, I guess, embolden feminism, right? Because feminism is about the equality of all genders. So what should we start? What should we stop? And what should we continue?
We do have a lot to unlearn, even within the feminist movements, in that let me phrase it this way, that we still have a lot to learn and to continue doing, to open up spaces, our spaces, to be more inclusive. There is so much to unlearn around what feminism is not, because I think a lot of people think of feminism from things they've read in magazines or they've heard, that does not truly represent feminism. Because if we're talking true feminism, we know that it is inclusive, it opens doors to everyone, we accept each other as a united front in fighting all forms of oppression, and that there isn't any one type of woman whose rights are to be put at the top at the expense of others. So for me, I'm just putting together there what needs to stop, what we need to do more of to cultivate this inclusion, true inclusion, and to be able to fight together and understand that by doing this, then we're building not just collective voice, but also collective power, truly to be able to fight the forces that are against us.
Saida Ali, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
insights
Thank you for
and
having me.
creating the space for us to have and continue these conversations on the South to South Solidarity
Thank you.
Dialogue.